In our alternative tier list series, yesterday we looked at the one about which specs were more likely to become meta and popular, not just based on the results, where we could have otherwise just said, okay, these specs are OP, play them, these specs are OP, play them. Instead, we looked at the results, sure, of the specs, but also tried to look at other things combined with those results. For example, what happens if multiple specs of the same class are having good results? What happens if Blood Decay is OP and Unholy are OP? Who's going to be played in Mythic Plus, where you're more likely to only play a single spec of the same class, for example? And we tried to make a list of which specs are looking like they're going to be meta or popular in the War Within once it releases. For today, we're doing something different. We are instead looking at which specs are needing the most changes from Blizzard. Whether it is nerfs or buffs or changes to their general talent tree being too bad, their spec talent tree being poor, their hero talent tree implementation being a failure, or perhaps the reverse, simply not even being changed at all by Blizzard in this entire beta cycle. And this is very different from what we looked at yesterday, because, for example, yesterday we mentioned Devastation, being quite poor. Quite poor because Augmentation is very powerful and popular, so they would have had less or fewer chances to become meta. But as a spec, in the way it plays and in the amount of help or changes they might want or need from Blizzard, they are doing pretty fine. Their biggest problem really is just Augmentation. Same for Preservation. We mentioned Preservation being quite low because the chances of them being popular, especially in Mythic Plus, with the existence of Augmentation, was being quite low, but as a spec right now, they are doing very well. They have multiple viable builds, they can play around their echoes with Dream Breath, they can play them around with Verdant Embrace and then heal with Lifebind, they can play around Flame Shaper and the burst AoE healing of the Engulf mechanic. They are doing very well. So in terms of changes required or wanted by Blizzard, they are doing pretty fine at the moment, which is quite different than simply putting them very low and saying they are weak. They wouldn't be low because they were weak, they would rather be low because of the power of Augmentation. So in this list, starting from healers this time around, after putting Preservation in a very good position, we start with the hipster reverse take, because for multiple times we have mentioned that across the several weeks of testing, these three specs were at the bottom, especially Discipline and Holy Priest. Instead, we are actually putting Holy Priest as doing quite fine, whereas Discipline, on the other hand, is doing worse. The problem for Holy Priest is just numbers based. If they were to get, for example, the Resto Druid treatment of getting buffed by about 30% in their power, which we will see in a couple of days. We have another round of Mythic Raid testing, and you will see the increased results of restoration after being buffed by quite a bit. For Holy Priest is somewhat the same. They don't have nearly as many problems in their talents. Talent 3, general talent 3, their hero talent is working just fine for Archon, so they don't have that many issues. The issues for Discipline are a little bit more deeper, as we said last time as well. You can fix Holy Priest by increasing their numbers. It's a bit more tricky to fix Discipline Priest. For starters, they have a completely dead hero talent 3, which is, at the very least, similar to Holy Priest, Oracle being a dead hero talent, but also they have problem in their talents, way more than Holy. Many of their talents are dead, they are unused or just a waste. They are much more fixed in what they can take. They have an entire line down their freshly added Ultimate Penitence, which is just not a feasible option for Discipline Priest. They have a practically broken tier set in the first season of the War Within because it cannot work with your ramp as a Discipline Priest. You're still chained by Void Summoner and just spending a third of your time using Smite to be able to fit your Mindbender or Shadow Fiend timings. So these are a bit more deeper problems than just, buff their healing. Mistweaver is doing pretty okay, not much really to say there. They have been very okay in Dragonflight. They have continued to be okay in the beta of the War Within, there isn't really many things you would like to see improved for Mistweaver as a spec right now. Another spec doing great is Resto Shaman. It's another spec we put quite low last time because we said if the other two Shaman specs are very good DPS, which is what it looks like right now, then perhaps the value of Resto Shaman might be low. But that doesn't change the fact that right now they play very well. They have been reworked, General 3 is much better, Spec 3 is much more smooth, Totemic is great for raid healing, even in Mythic Plus the slight buffs and bug fixes of Farseer and the interaction with Undulation have also made this quite a decent pick as well, so it's just looking very good right now. Resto Shaman. Notwithstanding the possible viability of the spec, the way it plays is great. Resto Druid and Holy Paladin, despite being the strongest healers, are controversially put in the middle. Resto Druid is put in the middle because despite being buffed multiple times in healing, they still have quite a few other issues. Their general talent tree is terrible, just like for the other Druid specs. They are still a bit pigeonholed in both of the trees. This one is specifically for Mythic Plus, this one is specifically for raid healing, this one is specifically to heal with your Grove Guardians. You are still a reasonably squishy spec, not as squishy as Balance because at least you have access to Ironbark as a healer, but you're still not that tanky. While the problems for Holy Paladin are in reverse. They are here because they are too powerful. They are here because you want to see them nerfed, not because you want to see them buffed. This is actually a good thing for Holy Paladin. It is much better to be nerfed now than to be nerfed at the release of the expansion or 1 week into the season, right? It's much better for you to stop huffing copium and expect Holy Paladin not to be nerfed. They simply do too many things with Holy Shock. The spec is so powerful you can literally tie Holy Shock to any other type of build, whether it is Holy Shock Light of Dawn, Holy Shock Eternal Flame, Holy Shock with Light of Dawn and Eternal Flame at the same time, using any of these combinations while getting Holy Power with Flash of Light, or getting Holy Power with Crusader Strike. Doesn't matter, they still top the meters regardless of what they are doing, regardless of the build, so they just need to be nerfed a little bit. So that's the kind of attention they need from Blizzard, not anything related to their build, their talents, or any kind of buffs. Now, for the tanks, we are not going this way when we mention the strongest healers when it comes to tanks, because for Prot Warrior and Blood DK, they are just doing great right now. In terms of nerfs, Prot Warrior was one of the least nerfed tanks during the changes to tanks of a few days ago. Their Indomitable nerf was the bigger one, but still, it's not a major one. Their pathing in their trees, both the spec tree but also the general tree, have been improved significantly. Mountain is a very powerful hero talent for Protection Warrior. They have been overall improved significantly from Dragonflight, and that's literally just it. They are doing very well right now. Blood DK, not nearly as much. They have not like changed nearly as much in their talent tree compared to Dragonflight. But they were already strong in Dragonflight. They were simply being overshadowed by the overpoweredness of Vengeance, for example, and also their hero talent trees have been very powerful. First, it was Sun Lane that was OP and nerfed multiple times. Even after being nerfed, that Bringer is still very powerful as well, even after being slightly nerfed recently. So Blood DK is also looking pretty good. Looking in reverse, in tanks that need more help, you would have Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin. Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin were the tanks receiving the largest nerfs from the set of tank nerfs of a few days ago. The hero talents of Prot are also not particularly strong, plus their two ways or best ways to self-heal or protect themselves, the Absorb Shield from Avenger's Shield and your Word of Glory, are significantly weaker now because your health has been increased and the way you heal yourself is based on attack power, but attack power has not been increased, which means your heal are scaling the same, but your health has gotten much larger. So your way to self-heal is much weaker now. So if on top of that you also get nerfed, like for example the duration of Eye of Tyr or the nerf to Righteous Protector, then you get even weaker, which is why you want to see quite a few more buffs to Protection Paladin. Same for Guardian, who received the largest amount of nerfs when it came to tank nerfs. Frenzied Regen has been absolutely destroyed. It has been nerfed by like 70% in how much it heals. The arcane damage healing and the Frenzied Regen healing have hurt Guardian Druid a lot, so you would like to see some kind of compensation buffs to make them a little bit stronger. Then you have the middle, which is going to be Vengeance, Demon Hunter, as well as Brewmaster Monk. Vengeance is here mostly because of a placebo effect. You know, you kind of think something is missing, something is not quite there. Most of this is because Illuminated Sigil has been nerfed. To be honest, you have lost your second charge of your CC sigils, whether it was the chains, the silence, or the fear. That's perhaps what makes you feel having the most problems. You also have your hero talents, Aldrachi River in particular, although not as big of a problem for Vengeance as it is for Havoc. It is still somewhat annoying, some extra thing to think about while you're tanking to weave around Fracture and Soul Cleave to gain these buffs. On top of that, devaluing quite a lot the power of Spirit Bomb and being able to play around Spirit Bomb because of the importance now of Soul Cleave if you're playing with Aldrachi Reaver. But as I mentioned, it's not that much. It's not that the rest of the spec has been changed greatly. You simply lost. Most of the change really was losing your second charge of sigils. For Brewmaster, it's a bit more of an ancient problem. Your ancient problem around stagger and around heavy hits and the way you deal with these heavy hits, especially in Mythic Plus, where you have a single healer. You have been arguably the most stable and staple raid tank since forever, because you have things like Celestial Fortune plus stagger plus you're playing with 4 or 5 healers, which makes you be extremely stable in the raid, which is kind of what you want in the raid. You want your tank to stay alive so you can keep progressing, and Brewmaster is great at that. But in Mythic Plus, where there is only one healer, and more often than not he's going to be busy healing the rest of the group, you have way more issues. And none of these issues are being addressed in the War Within. You still have issues with these kind of heavy stagger damage windows where you don't have nearly as good of a way to prevent that kind of damage or to self-heal yourself like other tanks can, asking more of your healers. The hero talents are not really doing anything for that. Even your currently most used Master of Harmony is just a whole ton of damage and not much really to fix that. So that's why you would like to see some extra help given to Brewmaster. Now finally, being in the DPS category, we have a few DPS that have been doing pretty well in the beta overall, that you would not be, essentially, you would not be too angry at seeing these DPS just be essentially released the way they are right now. All of these DPS specs right now, you should be fine seeing them released as they are. This doesn't even have to do necessarily with the power of their DPS right now or how powerful they are. Some of these, of course, are doing very well in terms of damage, but it's not necessarily because of that. They are just looking good as a whole. To be a little bit contrarian, we're not putting augmentation in here as well. We need augmentation to be fixed, right? Augmentation right now is creating a few too many problems in the meta, in the way it works and in the way it plays. But we all know this is the absolutely maximum copium take. There isn't really much you can change in a few patch notes that can stop the problems that augmentation can create in the game just by existing. Some specs benefiting from the positive overall changes of a class, like the Mage class or the Warlock class, are not doing nearly as well as the other two, but this is where, you know, the mind games might start playing a role. For example, Frost and Destruction. Frost and Destruction at the moment are the weakest specs in their respective classes. However, are they doing bad because they are doing poor damage? Then by simply buffing them by like 20% more damage, they will be doing much better? Or is it because they have more problems in their rotation, in their hero talents, in the way they are playing? Frost has been a question mark for a long time. Many players pointed out that even just being a 3-button spec was a problem, whereas many other players were playing Frost because it was a 3-button spec, so for them it wasn't nearly as big of a problem, for example. And Destruction was somewhat in the same category. Destruction isn't exactly a very complicated spec, so for many players this is not even seen as a problem. Especially specs, however, that do need way more help at the moment. We are now all clumping them up together. We have all of the rogues, we have Shadow Priest, Balance Druid, and Havoc Demon Hunter. So the problem for Havoc, as we touched slightly for Vengeance, is Eldrachi Reaver. At the moment, Eldrachi Reaver is far outperforming Felscard. The problem is that Eldrachi Reaver is putting even more cognitive load of being able to track multiple different buffs and then lining up these buffs in the same burst window of the rest of your kit, which is already pretty heavily filled with windows you have to play into, especially if you're playing Inertia, having to fit this 10-second buff within this 5-second window, within the 4-second window of Essence Break, to line up, of course, with I-Beam to get yourself your extra haste. This is seen as a bit too much by Havoc Demon Hunter standards. I know it looks weird, pointing out in current day that Havoc Demon Hunter is amongst the more complicated DPS specs in the game. Imagine mentioning this a few years ago, but here we are. Who definitely doesn't have this complexity problem is Balance Druid. Balance Druid is the opposite amongst the simplest of the DPS specs. They still have, similar to Guardian, a terrible general talent 3. They are one of the squishiest DPS specs in the game, especially after the reworks given to Hunter, making them more tanky, and Shaman, making them more tanky as well. Now it's Balance turn to be one of the weakest ones, which they were already. Their talent 3 is extremely strict. It leaves very little room for varying different talent points. Most of the differences in talent points you can pick are going to be, do you want to be AoE or single target, and that's about it. For Balance Druid, Eluna's Chosen isn't even doing them any favors, to the point where right now Starfire is almost becoming the be-all, end-all button to press that is even out-damaging Wrath in single target, even though it's supposed to be an AoE ability. And none of this has been changed or improved in a long time in the beta. That's why they need a lot of help right now. Talking about not being changed in a long time, you have Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest is the currently least changed spec in this beta cycle when it comes to DPS. Shadow Priest does have one of the worst talent 3s. They are now, after the reworks given to Hunter and Shaman, the talent 3 with the most amount of 2-pointers. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they have 5, 6, 7, and 8. They have 8 2-talent points, which is the most out of any other spec. They have a Hero Talent 3 Archon, which synergizes with nothing in their 3, and the other Void Weaver, which continues to be nerfed by Blizzard and is tied to Void Torrent, which is quite not very good, and on top of that also forces you to play the Void Torrent even in AoE situations, and even follow up with the extra talent to make it a 30-second cooldown to increase the value of Void Weaver. And as mentioned, they have received practically 0 changes since the beginning of the beta, and it has kept all of its problems. Again, putting them here and mentioning they have tons of problems doesn't mean they are awful, right? In the testing, Shadow Priest was just about average, you know, maybe even slightly above average, and when there was burst AoE, slightly below average, but that was about it. It wasn't anything extremely terrible. But the spec as a whole is still having problems. Same goes for the 3 rogue specs. Talking about not receiving many changes, the rogue specs have not really gotten that many improvements in this beta, despite being reworked just a few months ago. They have the world record practically of collecting the most bugs when it comes to their Hero Talent 3s and being unplayable. Right now they still have problems like Assassination being completely negated in trying to do AoE, Outlaw still being heavily target capped in AoE. Perhaps Subtlety is functioning slightly better than the other 2, but not by much. Talking about specs working well despite the results not being that amazing, you have Arms and Ret and Windwalker. You know, if you were to look at the results, for example, you know, Windwalker, and then you have Arms, and then you have Ret, and then in a more AoE fight you still have Arms down over here, Ret Paladin, Windwalker, Roshanan, AoE burst windows every minute or so. Here is Ret, here's Windwalker, here is Arms. So we're not talking about any particularly weak spec or particularly very strong specs. They're just playing and functioning well. right now. There aren't too many terrible things to complain about, especially Windwalker. If you looked at their old talent tree and then you change it to how it looks right now, it has been far improved compared to how it was before, especially the options you have to move around the talent tree compared to before for Windwalker. Ret already got this positive set of changes, to be fair, in the rework of a while ago, and Arms has received many of the similar QOL that Fury has received already. It is harder to judge Feral because Feral does retain similar problems of Guardian Druid and Balanced Druid and Restoration Druid, which is often about their general talent tree more so than their spec tree, and similar to other specs we have mentioned already, that their results, their DPS has been middling, not amongst the very bottom of results. So it is in that kind of a situation where you would still like to see positive changes for the spec without having some major glaring issues like some of the specs below them. For BM and marksmanship, you could probably put them still in specs in need of changes, although perhaps BM less so than marksmanship. Marksmanship unfortunately has received a series of nerfs to their Sentinel tree, which was the one thing that made them cope a lot about being very good, especially in Mythic Plus, because of the AoE damage of Sentinel and of Symphonic Arsenal, which have been nerfed by like 7 times in a month, and they got to be locked in the same target cap of practically the whole of marksmanship. 6 targets. You have Symphonic Arsenal doing reduced damage beyond 5 targets and same treatment given to Sentinel. However, they still were reworked. Their general talent tree is much better, their flow of their spec tree is much better, especially when you're trying to switch between AoE and single target for marksmanship. So perhaps this might even be a bit too harsh. Considering they have been changed and reworked very recently, they are definitely more modern than a few specs down here in terms of the positive QL changes in both of their talent trees. And this is, to finish, the current situation of the specs based on how many changes you would like to see Blizzard give any of these specs. To mention once more, this doesn't really have anything to do with how strong a certain spec is. Sometimes a spec can be doing very well, but not have nearly as many chances of being meta because another spec in their class is doing much better. Other times a spec might be doing poorly, but you know the spec itself is working nicely. All they need is a bump in numbers, for example. Other times a spec might be doing excessively well to the point you might see some changes in the negative for them. So that is what we wanted to highlight for today. Considering we have about a month left for the release of the expansion and then another 3 weeks for the release of the season and Mythic Plus and Mythic Raiding, these are kind of the level, the amount of changes we would like to see for the specs before we get to the full release of the first season of The War Within. This being done with on this Tuesday, we are now leaving each other. Thanks of course as usual for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, oh my god, I have come here to bargain. I have had to remake this video like 4 times over at this point.